Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. Long-time viewers of mine may recall seeing this design some time ago. In fact, I looked back through my job history and found that this client initially contacted me for a layout design back in January of 2020. So that would make this the longest gestating layout design that I've ever done. Over 4 years from start to finish. And of course we went through many iterations in that time. What I'm showing you now is the final version of the original design back in 2020 for a basement that the client was going to have excavated under his backyard, because there was no way of getting a space big enough for the kind of layout he wanted elsewhere in his home. Anyway, the COVID lockdown considerably delayed his building remodel, and during that delay the client went through various redesigns of the basement. Initially his intention was to abandon the car lift in this corner and also the swimming pool, which was going to be in this cutout in the top left. The reason for abandoning the pool was that he discovered that it wasn't going to get enough sun. It was just going to be in the shade too much of the day. So they abandoned that and figured they didn't really need the extra car storage in the basement, and his intention was to use the entire area for the railroad, improving on what we came up with the first time round. But as the basement design increased in size, it also increased in cost, and also the planning commission was requiring him to have more and more deep earth space under his yard, so he wasn't able to get as large an excavation as he wanted. So after cutting back the basement size slightly, this is what he came up with. It is nominally about 20 feet by 40, so it's still a good sized space. And we now have the stairs coming down in the middle in a very convenient location, because it means we can go all the way around without having to have moving sections or turn back curves at the ends. If I overlay that basement on the original design, we see that it's somewhat smaller than the original. So with the new design, something has to give. At the end of the video, feel free to come back and compare the final version with this one. Now, the concept for the new design was to be pretty much the same as the old one. A double track main line through a significant yard with a single track subdivision to a harbour and intermodal yard, with huge amounts of staging below and as much open running as can be fitted in the remainder of the space. Other than rearranging everything to get it in the new basement size, the most significant change was that the client wanted to go from a west coast port to an east coast port. So it means the whole layout has to be built the other way around. If you follow the various routings on this design, you'll see that wherever you view the layout from, the harbour is towards the left. In the new design, the harbour needs to be towards the right. This is the basic design that I came up with after several false starts. I moved the main yard away from where it was along the outer wall to a site in the middle. Now, although that sacrifices a few feet of length, it does allow the routing to be correct, with the harbour being towards the operator's right. And that we both felt was very important in the design, showing the East Coast port instead of a West Coast. Now, as you can see from this, the schematic for the main level is pretty much the same as it was. We come out of staging through the main yard, and the main line continues partway around the room through a small industrial town, and the single track subdivision to the harbour branches off, although the junction is now in a different location. It's at the industrial town rather than the main yard. And then that single track to the harbour passes the ethanol plant. We had to eliminate the other town on that division, but the client wasn't too concerned about that. I did show the possibility of using this area for a paper mill, which would keep the same number of switching locations, and he felt that was preferable anyway. I'm still showing room for a couch, although that later had to be eliminated because we lost a little bit of width on the room, and we would no longer have been able to get the couch in while maintaining a 3-foot aisle and sufficient width for the harbour and intermodal yard. Now, in order to get the main line looping continuously through the lower level staging yard, there's one helix in the peninsula at the bottom of the stairs, and the other one I experimented with 2 possible locations. one at the base of the peninsula, and one in the bottom left corner. Although with the main line disappearing from view in the top right corner and heading behind the ethanol plant and down under the harbour, I wasn't sure whether I was even going to need these helixes. I was thinking that I might only need a single lap somewhere. So next I started working on possible routings to get the main lines between the levels. This S-curve at the end of the peninsula was drawn in just to ensure that there was sufficient space to get into the helix. Bear in mind, of course, that on one deck the main line will be running straight into the helix, and on the other deck it has to come out of the back. Now, in order to get the staging yard along this wall, which I felt was the most likely location for it, I started drawing in possible alignments with the turn-back curve, pair of crossovers. I normally like to get the crossovers closer to the staging tracks, but in this situation it would have meant sacrificing about 5 feet of length on every staging track. So that's why they are drawn the other side of the curve. Ignore this portion for the time being. This was just the staging yard ladder from the previous design that I cut and pasted into this one just to give me an idea of how much space it took up if I turn this curve the other way around. Now, with the loop in this corner, the workshop area under the railroad becomes rather cramped, so I tried another alternative. Here I've eliminated that loop, moved it to the base of the peninsula, where more of it can be under bench work that we already have, and that does give a lot more space for the workshop, even though it's a rather awkward shape. And with this arrangement, the two crossovers would be split, one on this reverse curve and one on this one where the mouse is. Now, as I didn't really like the curve being in this area, instead of taking away a lot of workbench space, I toyed with the idea of running it down the peninsula to a turn-back curve at the end, and this gives more than enough length. So next I started experimenting with how to use the rest of the space on the lower level. So here is one possible arrangement for the lower level. It's assuming that I'm extending the ramp with the curve under the end of the peninsula as last time. And the red main line shows the amount of space we have available for a nice long scenic run on the lower level. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that particular routing of the ramp down to the lower level is a lot longer than it needs to be. And although it means we have a nice gradual grade, it does mean a longer hidden run. So I looked for another possibility. Here what I've done is split the low-level scenic run so it could be half at each end of the run. Coming from staging in one direction, using the red route and up the helix, we appear at the main yard, whereas if we run from staging in the other direction, over the green route, we then use the ramp that runs all the way around the outside of the room and come out on the upper deck just behind the ethanol plant. So we still have east to the right and west to the left, everywhere except on the red portion of the railroad. And the client decided he liked the idea of splitting this extra scenic run into two areas for opposite ends of the railroad. And it has the advantage that we can represent different types of scenery on these areas, since they are visually well removed from the rest of the railroad. So here is the next development of the lower level. I'm showing a pair of divided main lines running down the peninsula. The intention is to develop that as a mountainous area, and we may even put more pine trees on this area and let it represent somewhere further west, because the client does like both east and west scenery, even though operationally we're going to be in the east. There's a location right at this end of the scene where we have the start of a sharp curve just in the visible portion, and that's crying out for a scene inspired by the very famous State Line twin tunnels. On the other end, we're thinking maybe a fall scene with a small town, which can have a couple of small industries to switch if he wants them. And I've also put a junction here and one by the staging yard, giving us a Y arrangement so that we can use the same reversing loop to turn trains in either direction. Anyway, the client decided that he really liked this arrangement of the lower level. So then I went back to work on the upper level again. Here it is with the main yard and the paper yard filled in. Now, this is not intended to be the final version of the yard. What I'm doing here is just seeing how much yard will fit in the space. I don't really like the shape of it. It looks kind of boring. But what I have tried to do is get it so that the turnout ladders are at the front, meaning that the shorter tracks are at the front of the yard with the longer ones behind. That way, when an operator is classifying cars, he can read the reporting marks for the last couple of cars in each cut. And that is very desirable on a model railroad, especially when it's the upper deck of a double-deck railroad, so it has to be fairly high up, maybe even a few inches higher than ideal. Now, any viewers who did not watch the original presentation for the earlier design may wonder why I have a steam engine terminal on the same layout as an intermodal yard. Well, the client likes double stacks and modern diesels, but he also wanted to run a few steam locomotives. So what we're doing is building the steam engine terminal as a working museum, being all that remains of another abandoned railroad. By presenting it as a museum, he can place steam locomotives from any era and any region, even some foreign ones if he wants to. And every session he can run an excursion train, and one of these steam locomotives will provide power for it. It's just an excuse to run a steam locomotive on an otherwise modern railroad without it looking out of place. Here is the next iteration with the harbour and the intermodal yard filled in. Note how the yard tracks here are somewhat shorter than the train length that we're aiming for. That's not a problem. It is normal on the prototype for intermodal trains, or any trains really, but especially intermodal trains, to double over into multiple tracks. The important thing is to make sure the track arrangement allows a train to pull through and get half of it beyond the yard, which is why these yard leads extend to the corner of the room, and then the train can be split and the front half backed into a vacant track. At this stage, although the upper harbour area had become quite pleasing both to me and to the customer, the lower harbour area still left a lot to be desired. I'm still showing the twin car floats from the previous railroad. The client felt that that was unnecessary, that he'd rather go to a single car float and use the space for something else. And of course I haven't started doing the ethanol plant yet. That will be next. So here it is with the ethanol plant filled in. Basically what I did was just copied it from the previous design, turned it round, and then adjusted it to fit. It's still basically the same design as in the previous layout. We have the grain receiving at one end, all the various stages of the process in order, with the various shipping tracks at the other end. I've redone the lower harbour with just a single car float, the necessary float yard, and a couple of industries, and bringing back the steep grade down to the harbour, which was a scene that the client really liked from my own personal layout. And he was very happy that I was able to incorporate that in this plan. The switching lead for the car float just disappears under the bridge and into the scenery. At this point I went back to the lower level, drew in a possible staging yard, and also started working on elevations. Now, with the normal desk height being about 29 inches, I decided to aim for 33 inches for the base staging yard elevation. It allows just enough of a step so it's possible to get outlets along the back of the workbench under the track. I found I had to gain a fair bit of height around the top side of the railroad before disappearing from view, so that the rest of the climb is within range of what can be done with a 3/4 lap of the room coming out in this top corner. Here is the elevations on the upper deck, and you see I've also filled in the small industrial town along the top edge. Now, the main problem I ran into with that grade was that in order to get the grade running down to the harbour, it has to enter the upper deck at the highest elevation of 59 inches. So at this point we decided that the design was about as done as it could be until we had some finalised dimensions for the basement. The client was liking all the main features of the railroad and how it fitted into the space, but it seemed that every drawing that came back from his architect, the basement would change size slightly for one reason or another. One thing the client did say at this point was that he was going to try to squeeze an extra few feet on the length. Also, at this point in the design, the client was still experiencing delays with his home remodel, and the basement was still some months away from being configured. So this design was put away while I worked on other jobs. And this is probably a good place to break the video be sure to tune in next week and I will take this layout design through to its conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation so far, and I hope to see you back then. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.